Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media. The mainstream media and international community have largely ignored the atrocities and genocide that is going on in my home country of South Africa. As economic refugees living abroad, we as independent media fight to expose the truth and find solutions for the many suffering and impoverished people still stuck in South Africa. This is Stop South African Genocide, hosted by Mel V and Karin Smith, live on CCN.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to yet another edition of Stop South African Genocide live here on Conscious Consumer Network. As always, it is great to be with you this evening, the 7th of November. It is 7 p.m. GMT, and of course, as always, I'm joined by my most gracious co-host, Karin Smith, and our guest this evening, Nicholas John Griffin, Nick Griffin, a British politician who has been championing various aspects of the South African cause and been on with Karin before. And before I get into your astute history, Nick, I just want to say thank you for joining us. It's great to finally have you joining us on CCN.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so first off, I wanted to ask you to just give a little bit of an insight into your history and why you decided to get into politics. I mean, a lot of people nowadays are kind of losing faith in the political arena as a place for change. So what has inspired you to go that route?
Well, I got involved in politics at a very young age. I grew up in a very political, right-wing conservative family in London. My parents actually met at a Communist Party meeting. They'd gone to heckle to disrupt not long after the Second World War. And so I grew up with that sort of atmosphere. And in the early 70s, everybody in Britain who was involved in politics, whether on the right or the left, believed that basically Britain was being what we then called Finlandized, gradually turned into a satellite of the Soviet Union. I was very, very anti-communist, and I got involved in fairly radical nationalist politics at the age of 15 because they appeared to be the only people telling the truth about communism and being prepared to stand up to communist aggression on the streets. So I had a long history, first of all, on the National Front, and then in the middle 1990s, I joined the British National Party and ended up being elected as a member of the European Parliament for the BNP for 5 years between 2009 and 2014.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. And you've obviously had a very controversial run whilst you've been in politics. What compels you at the moment to continue down this road?
I suppose good old traditional bloody British bloody mindedness. I'm not going to be told what I can and can't do and what is not, what is right and what is wrong by people who are very definitely in the wrong.
Okay, all right. So share a little bit of your perspective as to what the political climate is like in the UK. I lived there for 10 years, and I know there's obviously a lot of a cross between xenophobia to somewhat people being very concerned about the influx of various groups into places and taking over. I'd like to hear a little bit of your position on this.
Yeah, I would say it's not xenophobia. That's very much, it's not quite as extreme a leftist word as racism, but it's used in the same way to demonize a very natural desire of human beings to be somewhere familiar, to be basically with their own kind. And nobody in Britain, almost without exception, has ever minded a limited amount of immigration from all parts of the world. But the scale of immigration whereby, say, I go back to London occasionally when I have to, which is my home city. It's where I was born. My parents were born there. My grandparents lived there. 3 of my grandparents were air raid precaution wardens in the Second World War there. There's a long history there. I go back to London now and I'm a minority, absolutely a minority as a white man, and people like Albanian Muslims are classed as white in our statistics. So actually, as a British Londoner, I'm a very much a minority. I hear young Londoners speak, and they don't even speak with the accent that the people I grew up with spoke with. They speak a sort of a bastardized West Indian patois with some Pakistani thrown in and African, but they no longer sound. There's no Cockneys anymore. When we get the occasional jihadist psychopath in Syria from Britain filmed executing people, cutting their heads off, and the liberal media say he's speaking with a London accent. No, he's not. He's not speaking with a London accent that we all knew as real Londoners. And when you find yourself a shrinking minority in your own capital city, at that point, you know this has gone too far. And it's not racism or xenophobia to say that something should be done. The tragedy is it's too late for anything to be done.
There's absolutely two sides to this particular whole race debate. And, you know, it's very difficult, particularly like Karin and myself, where we've come in from a country like South Africa. We regularly get targeted as being racists. And we're nothing of the kind. We actually very much understand the dynamic of what is playing out, particularly because of the fact that we're South African and watching our very own people being exterminated. And we're also very well aware that this program is beginning to roll out in other parts of the world, perhaps not an outright genocide like it is in South Africa, but certainly an influx of people who are coming in from other places. Now, I would like to say that I actually moved to London in 1999. I just went over there as a South African on a working holiday visa, and I met my husband, who was a banker in the city, and I ended up getting married and ended up living there for 10 years before moving off to Holland. And I noticed, like you said, there is a tolerance towards a limited number of people coming in, because all the people I work for really enjoyed having a South African work for them because they considered us to work hard. And they, I've always found that there was a good acceptance of the Australians and the Kiwis who came through and also participated in the economy by working and paying taxes and whatever else. There was always a limited tolerance towards that. I never felt that there was a xenophobia towards people coming in, but it's when people come in and take advantage of the welfare system and the funds that should actually be going into the infrastructure of the country, but it's going into, it looks like mass importing people from other parts of the world. And we kind of all sat around scratching our heads, if you don't know what's going on, going, what the hell's going on here, and what is this all about? Until you take into consideration that there is a subversive agenda to kind of wipe out the white race. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely so. And when I was in the European Union, really I was in the heart of the beast. And you've got, your people will find them on YouTube, there's an assortment of senior current EU politicians who mainly Dutch and Germans, who said quite openly that the sooner white Europeans are replaced, the better, and it's all a wonderful process. And the European Union's founder, Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, wrote in 1926 that this was the aim. Because I think a lot of people say in Britain with parties like UKIP, which American audience will have heard of through the Nigel Farage and Donald Trump campaign and so on. So UKIP have always said that the European Union is about destroying the nation state, destroying the institutions of the nation state, which of course it is. You can't build the united Europe, this sort of socialist fantasy. You can't build that while you have the old nation states intact. But UKIP and people like them tend to get so fixated and stuck on the question of the institutions of the state. They miss the point that the European Union, even before it was founded, from its very inception as an idea, also the people who creating this understood perfectly well that from European history, that you can abolish a state, but as long as the people who created that state, who created that nation, still exist and are still a majority in a part of the world, then they always have the capacity to have at some stage a nationalist revival, a freedom fight, and take back their independence. So therefore, the European Union from the very beginning was based not on the idea just of getting rid of the institutions of the nation states, but also replacing the people who created them in the first place so that there could never be any effective resistance. And we're now a very long way down that road. People still say, oh, we need a political party to turn things around. It's too late to turn things around for demographic reasons. the white population of Europe, the European population, still looks really very large, but a huge number of them are the baby boomers of the 1945-46 generation, and even more from the sort of the early 1960s baby boom. In 20 years' time, we'll either all be in nursing homes or dead, roughly speaking. So the population of the whole of Europe is going to get on towards halving over the next 30 years. And the dying Europeans, it's not a genocide, they haven't bred lots of kids and they're getting old. So the dying Europeans are being replaced by Africans and Arabs. And the people running the show think this is great. A French analyst from the not so radical right came up with the phrase a few years ago, the Great Replacement, to describe what's going on. And that is what's going on all over Western Europe.
That's interesting. You know, I live in Portugal at the moment, and it's very much public knowledge here that we've got an aging population. And, you know, even here, we've still got, it's a bit of a difficult one, because you have a history where the Moors occupied these territories for a while. So there's a lot more of a cultural tolerance towards, obviously, Muslim cultures, because it plays into the historical context. So it's always a precarious one to turn around and say, yeah, you know, well, maybe that's just the way the tides turn. Maybe now is a time when we go towards that. But there seems to be a deliberate agenda to kind of eliminate the white race. And what I find very interesting is your views include that of Holocaust denial. I'd be very interested to hear some of the research and beliefs that you hold in this area, because this is something that's becoming more and more into the public consciousness as more and more information becomes available.
It's something which would be very interesting to talk about, but the laws of various European countries, which I go to frequently, France and Germany included, absolutely forbid it. They insist that the orthodoxy established at the Nuremberg trials is indeed correct, and I'm simply not going to argue about that, because when one does, it's always taken out of context. It's always used to imply that one's anti-Semitic and so on, even though, well, when I was first on trial many years ago for, among other things, discussing this issue, one of the people who offered to come to help me was a young Jewish man who'd studied the whole subject, had come up with very unorthodox opinions. In the end, he was terrorized by the Zionist bloc into recanting. But that was it. But there's no point talking about it because it is misunderstood. There's no doubt that the Jews were persecuted by the Nazis ruthlessly and brutally, and there were many horrible crimes. It's one of the horrible crimes of a bloody century. But I think it's futile to get tangled up in what happened in the last century, especially when my father and his generation fought against it. It's futile getting tangled up in that when what we need to be discussing is how a fragment of the European peoples and the Christian peoples of the world are going to survive the coming demographic winter. Because unless we come up with some strategies better than just hoping it'll all go away, then our grandchildren are going to be extinguished in their own places of birth and their places which are theirs by right and heritage.
Yes, indeed. Another tool, you know, there's many of us who have gotten to an age, and I'm one of these people, been married at 16 years, still don't have kids because obviously I'm really kind of looking at the world and going, how can our children hope to inherit a fair, just, peaceful, sustainable world in this current condition with the current corruption, with all of this going on? And yet I actually think there's a psychological sterilization going on towards people like us that's actually stopping us from bringing kids out into this world, and that adds to the problem. But you know, it kind of goes round in circles on itself. But I realize that obviously the way, if you were to talk about what you were saying, to, of course, not get rid of the white races, you know, all of us have to carry on having kids. But look at what we've got going on in South Africa, where, for example, white people can't get social welfare, and it's almost impossible for kids to get jobs. There's a huge generation of white school leavers who we have no idea what's going to happen to them, because they simply will not be able to enter the job market under the current British, I beg your pardon, Black economic empowerment laws. And I was wondering if you thought that this kind of thing might be following through or carrying on in the UK at any point, whether they're actually going to start implementing laws that forbid certain demographic groups from taking employment.
Well, we already have it to a degree. It's not as drastic as that. When you're trying to boil a frog, you don't throw it in boiling water, you turn the heat up slowly. But we've had for years so-called positive discrimination in favour of ethnic minorities, as they call them. And of course, positive discrimination for one group has to be negative discrimination for the others. So part of the reason, say, for the Brexit vote was the fact that the European Union became perceived by particularly the white working class as a sort of a touchstone, a symbol of everything that's gone wrong, including the fact that white working class boys are now the very bottom of the educational attainment ladder and the very bottom of our society. And the liberal elite really don't seem to give a damn about it. So these things are happening, well, that's happening under a Conservative government. If in a few years' time we have a Labour government under Jeremy Corbyn, who's really a self-confessed Marxist, then it will get even worse. But this is no surprise. It's not avoidable. Sorry, it's unavoidable when you have a ruling elite which is against you, and the young dynamic section of the population really is mainly other people's, and our own people stubbornly refuse to breed. As for not having welfare benefits, when the Boers first brought civilization and created South Africa, there weren't any benefits then, but they were in a position to get on and do it. In Britain, when I've got 4 grown-up children, we couldn't afford our children. There were times, quite genuinely, when the meat they ate was things we found dead on the road when they were very young, because we were very, very poor, and that was it. But if you allow these things to persuade you to not to have children, then equally, well, if you don't have children, you can have another holiday this year, or a bit of a bigger house and all the rest of it. And the years slip by, we'll wait a bit longer. And then certainly it's too late for people who've done that to have a large family. And the world is inherited not by the meek, it's always inherited by people who have kids. Now I've lost the sound here. Yeah.
No, we muted ourselves. We were laughing so hard.
Sorry, that was very funny. I am going to post that on Facebook. Because that's true, because that is so true. The world will be inherited by our kids, but you can't blame people like me for looking around and going, what is it that our children are actually inheriting, and is this the wisest idea in the world with all of this corruption and stuff going on? And I suppose as a South African, there is a lot of inbred fear because of what we've seen and what we've been through and what we've experienced, and those of us who've gotten out, what we're watching, those who are still stuck there, what they're experiencing, losing their jobs, not being able to get any kind of support, and being marginalized as an ethnic minority. And I'm kind of watching this play out subversively in other parts of the world, very much so, and wondering, kind of how this is going to end up, and what do you think we should do? You just get it on and have kids, is what you're saying.
Well, that's a very large part of it. There's really 2 factors, actually. The first is to have children, but decent numbers of children. And secondly, it's having had them, it's to insulate them from the cancer of liberalism, which if young people are brought up in that, you can almost guarantee that the next generation will be lost to us, to our culture, to our traditions, and so on. They'll be turned into good little liberals and turned on to gender politics and persuaded they're gay or they need a sex change at the age of 4 or whatever. This is happening now in Britain. There's an explosion of the number of very young children being treated with hormones because they decided, because they've seen it on television or they've been told about it in school, that that they're a boy in a girl's body, or vice versa. Now, the actual medical facts of this are that the vast majority of kids who genuinely feel this grow out of it when they reach adolescence and are very happy in the end and go on to become normal, well-adjusted adults, whereas there's a catastrophically high rate of mental illness and even suicide amongst children who've been put through these processes with the help of, frankly, perverse liberal doctors and social workers. So these things are happening. I can understand people being very nervous about bringing children into this world, but the thing to do is, it's actually, for those of you listeners who are devout Christians, they'll know that time and time again in the Bible there's injunctions that when you're surrounded by evil people, by people who are not obeying the laws of God and so on, then the answer is to withdraw from them. That's the reason the Boers went to South Africa in the first place, to get away not just from persecution, but also from being in a society which wasn't ruled according to the rules of God as they saw them. So that's why they went there, and they survived in South Africa for hundreds of years. I think now that the time is up for our people in various countries. As to what happens next, actually there was a rear admiral in the British Navy in 2006 or 2007, Rear Admiral Chris Parry, who gave to Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and he gave a talk there in which he said that according to what the intelligence services had worked out, sort of looking ahead and planning ahead and analysing and predicting things, he said that they believed that unless things were turned around by the politicians, and this is what, now just over 10 years ago, unless things were turned around, then the combination of mass immigration and Islamism would bring about a collapse of Western civilization throughout Western Europe on a scale, on a par with that of the collapse of the Roman Empire, with all that entails. And we are talking appalling bloodshed, a catastrophic collapse of civilization, a cataclysmic collapse of the population in the most horrible way possible. And when asked about this, he and indeed the head of the British Armed Services said, "We're not saying it's going to happen. We're saying it will happen unless the politicians do something." And of course, the politicians haven't done anything, or rather, they continue to do what's created this disaster in the first place. So we're now in that position. So I think it's only realistic to say that there's going to be the most appalling upheavals and agonies in the death throes of Western liberal Europe. And if you want to survive, then you have to find places where there's governments who want our people and our civilization and our religion to survive. And the great thing is that if you'd gone back 10 years ago, you could have said, well, there's probably nowhere in the world where that's the case. If you now look, you now find Russia, Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, so the Visegrad 4 bloc of states. All their leaders have said quite openly and consciously that our people across Europe are threatened with being overwhelmed by mass immigration. We mustn't allow it. We must protect our countries. We must protect our people, and we will be the beacons of European civilization. And to come back to the analogy with the collapse of the Roman Empire, the civilization that existed in that, when it all collapsed, was kept alive, and Christian values and decency and the sparks that later became the Renaissance were kept alive in tiny monasteries perched on rocks on in the middle of the North Atlantic, basically off the coast of Scotland, off the coast of Ireland, and a handful of men went out in due course as missionaries and relit the flame of civilization in Western Europe. And that will happen again. But this time, the bastion of our people and Christendom is going to be in the center of Europe and possibly also in Russia.
Wow. Okay, so obviously it's an interesting debate to decide whether or not this is going to be something that, you know, we want to bring our children into. Because as you're talking, I'm just thinking, you know, all I hear here is, you know, excuses as to why not to have kids. But at the same time, it is really the only way we are all going to stop this complete white genocide from happening. And Karin, you know, you and I have been doing the show for some time now, and this is something that gets very contentious when we start talking with Black people and people of other races, and they really do believe that the white race needs to be exterminated because we are now carrying the sins of the people before us. But to a certain extent, this white guilt that's been put out is part of an agenda to really propagate what is going on. And what you're talking about, Nick, what do you say?
Yeah, it is a deliberate agenda. There's an element perhaps in terms of, you know, the colonialist idea that, you know, we're guilty of various things. There's an element of truth to that. On the other hand, for everything we took out, say, of India, we also put in hospitals, railways, the sewage system, schools, universities. We stopped them burning widows on funeral pyres. So all sorts of good. I think that the great shame of the British Empire, that the shame of the Americans was indeed what was done to especially the Plains Indians, although they were no saints themselves. And basically the white man did to them what they've been doing to each other, but rather more efficiently. But in terms of the guilt of the British Empire, I think that the creation of concentration camps and the killing through institutionalized neglect at best of 22,000 Boer women and children is probably the worst thing that the British Empire did. But even so, although I've always said, you know, that was wrong, and personally it's driven me to try to do things to help the Boers by way of sort of trying to make amends, it's still not something for which I personally am guilty, or my children are guilty, or anyone left alive in Britain is guilty. So this whole thing is used against us as a moral club, and it's used against us by various people. The far left, which now has extended its fundamentally anti-Christian and therefore anti-white European mentality right the way through, even into so-called conservative parties in Britain and most of Europe. The far left hates us primarily because when the communists in 1926, then again in 1968, set about analysing why hadn't there been the revolution which Marx promised in the most advanced countries in Western Europe, where it was supposed to happen first. The communists concluded it was because the folk consciousness of European people, and especially their addiction to Christianity and to their nation states, was so strong that the communists couldn't overcome it. Hence, they decided that they'd, instead of going head to head with this and having failed revolutions, they'd set about through the Frankfurt School and then through the 68 generations, long march through the institutions and cultural Marxism. They'd set about dismantling our culture and our civilization, while at the same time as setting about flooding us with migrants from all over the world with the deliberate intention of breeding us out of existence. So, as I said earlier on, the people, the elite who created the European Union had that same idea of getting rid of us as a people and replacing us. The far left has developed the same desire to get rid of us and to replace us as a people. There's an element within not just the Zionists, but I would say Talmudists, not ordinary Jews, but Jews who adhere and culturally adhere to the appalling race hate of the Talmud, which many Jews do not. For those who do, they see themselves not just as a people chosen by God in a religious sense, but it's their right and their duty to dominate the whole of the world. And the Christians have got in the way, so the Christian Goyim must be exterminated. I'm afraid that's there to say most definitely, not with all Jews. If you really want to find someone who will explain this and talk about it and educate people about it, you can turn to people like Israel Shamir, people like that, who've very openly said that this is the most appalling racism within a section of their own community, and they want to see it gone. But it is very powerful. So then on top of that, of course, you've got simply big business capitalism, which is probably the biggest factor in all of this. Capitalism wants profit, for which it needs cheap workers, And now it's not just that, it also needs consumers. And this is going to become more and more a factor, encouraging people with business or politicians who do the bidding of big business to say we've got to have more immigrants, not to do the work, because robots can do the work more and more, but robots can't consume, and nor for that matter do old people. And our population is mainly old. The people who consume, whether they're making the money themselves or whether they're on welfare and they're being funded by other taxpayers, the people who consume most are young people. So capitalism needs young people. Since our population hasn't got that many, capitalism needs immigration. And because capitalism needs immigration, it's not just the left want mass immigration, which is replacing us in our own homelands. Also, the conservative right want it as well. And that is why it cannot be fought politically. The only way to fight it is to get the hell out of its way, to get your families out of its way to places where they'll be appreciated for what they are, Christian white Europeans.
It's interesting you brought up the Boers, obviously, because we're seeing this happening in great numbers in South Africa. These people who are just wanting to have freedom of expression, to practice their own religion. And this has been a historical thing with them. We're seeing it play out again and again. And I do want to bring in here, obviously, I didn't want to talk about the Holocaust, but I wanted to know if you would comment on this. I recently came across a speech that Hitler did where he absolutely condemned Britain for their actions against the Boers, surprisingly, because obviously that was the first place where there was concentration camps, and then this supposedly happened again during in Germany during the Second World War. That's where the concentration camp idea actually took root, was in the Anglo-Boer War. It was 40 years before it ever happened in Germany. And yet there seems to be this rewriting of history that's kind of shifted all the blame onto Hitler without actually looking at the fact that there were certain things that he did, for example, putting a number of the Jewish bankers into jail, condemning the Boer War, which is why it's hard to believe that he was responsible for the concentration camps, because he was the speeches he did about Britain were absolutely incredible. And again, I'm not a fan of Hitler, and I'm not a Holocaust denier, but what I am saying is the more and more you start digging up the facts about history, the more it seems that we've been lied to really cover up a lot of uncomfortable truths, that there is a sort of social engineering agenda going on, and it's been going on for a very long time, and there have been certain attempts from various parties to fight back and to preserve various cultures, even within South Africa. And I use Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd as one of the people who really did try to preserve cultures by establishing self-determining parts of the world where the Bantu people could actually preserve their culture, teach in their language, run their own governments, much like the white people, but it was labeled under the guise of things like apartheid. And they assassinated him. I mean, after one attempt, they finally got him on the second attempt. And they were adamant to get rid of him because this cultural preservation seems to really fly in the face of some very dark agenda. What do you think about that?
Yeah, indeed it does. As for Hitler and the Boers, I think what he said obviously was absolutely accurate on that. But you shouldn't really use Hitler as someone who's against racism and genocide, because he did make a very serious attempt to genocide the Poles and the Russians, as well as brutalizing the Jews of Central Europe. And in fact, if you really want to see one person who's responsible for where we are today, it's Adolf Hitler, because he was almost the only man in world history who could have gone into Bolshevik Russia, where millions of white Russians, Christian Russians, had already been murdered and brutalized by the Bolshevik regime, which was a sort of early version of ISIS, basically imposed on the country from outside, funded by the banks in the United States, with the key revolutionaries imported from abroad, just like ISIS, for very much the same reasons. And Hitler managed to go into Russia and treat the Russian people so abysmally, quite openly saying, because we want this land, that he lost the war. And at the same time demonized anyone who says, yes, I want to preserve my white my European heritage, as some kind of monster who's going to end up exterminating people. So I think we need to leave him very, very firmly in the history books. And it doesn't need anyone else to say that what the British did to the Boers was wrong morally. It was wrong in actual fact. And the impact was felt, still is felt today, because if those 22,000 mainly young women and children had lived and gone on to have children, it would to an extent have changed the demographics. I was looking up earlier on before we started that in 1911, so it was even after the Boer War and that tragedy and the loss of life, 22% of South Africa was white. 22% in 1911. And now it's 7.4%. And out of the young people, I was looking up that in the 0 to 14-year-olds, 17% of whites in South Africa can't fall into that bracket, 0 to 14, but 32% of blacks. So there is no possibility of holding onto a country with those demographics. When the Boers went there, yes, they were outnumbered, but large parts of it, as I'm sure you know far better than me, large parts of Southern Africa were empty, or at least there were no Bantu there. There was the Bushmen there. So you basically had a clash between a primitive Stone Age people in tiny numbers, hunter-gatherers, and people from Western Europe with firearms and armour and so on. So they had the technological edge and, relatively speaking, quite significant numbers. And then by 1911, 22% of our people could hold any, vast numbers of others in subjection if they wanted to, which I think would be wrong. Again, I think what the Boers did wrong was to expect other people to empty their bins and make their beds and till their farms and not demand the rights of human beings. And if the Boers from the beginning had said, no, it's our moral duty to clean our own bins, to till our own farms, and if they'd established a monoracial society in part of South Africa, they'd probably still be there today running that society. But they didn't, and that's history. So the position now is that they're now 7% of the population, they're mainly old, and they don't have the superiority in weapons. In fact, they're probably the most disarmed people in the whole of South Africa. I think under those circumstances, you have to say that for all, I understand very well the deep emotional attachment to the land of my fathers and all the rest, and the bones of our forefathers are here, and we fought at Blood River and we won. But at Blood River, the Boers were armed with guns, and the Africans mainly had spears, so they stood a chance of winning. Now the Boers have sticks, and the Africans have AK-47s. They're not going to win. So it's not cowardice or running away. I would say that the Boers trekked to get to somewhere where they could be themselves, where they could worship their God their way, and where they could be independent. They trekked there. Now they must trek again, as must the people of Western Europe. And the thing to do is to find a way to open the door in places like Hungary. Now, in terms of sort of trying to be positive, because people might be thinking, I'm going to go away and cut my throat after this. This is terrible. So in terms of being positive, Hungary, from which I'm banned, incidentally, which hasn't exactly helped the efforts that I was making to try and open a door for the Boers, when Karin and I spoke about this before. But Hungary is the only state, I think, in the world which now has established a ministry, actually a full ministry, whose sole job is to look out for and find ways to help persecuted Christians overseas. I know several of the people who work in that ministry. And I think that this is what the people who are concerned about Boer survival need to do. They really need to put together a package produced in South Africa, showing oppressed Christians, showing what's going on, and appealing direct to the Hungarian government. Basically, put your money where your mouth is. You've established a ministry. You say you want to help oppressed Christians. You also say you acknowledge that Hungary also has a serious demographic problem. Its birth rate's about 1.7 children per woman of childbearing age, which means probably a 30-40% drop in its population over the next 30 years. But when you take out the Hungarian gypsies, who are an Asiatic criminal clan, basically, when you take out their birth rate, and you get down to about 1.2 children per Hungarian woman of childbearing age, Hungary in 100 years' time will have at most 1 million Hungarians. Presently it's 10 million. They're going to be wiped out unless they increase their birth rate. Now, Orban has seen this, and he's making really serious efforts to do so. But he's also saying that people who are fleeing persecution and the problems caused by mass immigration in Western Europe, they're welcome as well. Now, he said this, and then when I said, well, I'm being persecuted, I fear for my family and my grandchildren and so on, and I want them to come and live here in due course, I duly get banned from Hungary. Perhaps that's because I'm a very bad person and I'm very extreme, and Mr. Orban doesn't want to be associated with me. Fair enough. But where you've got Boer families who are literally in fear of their lives every single day and can show the most appalling pictures of their neighbours who've been tortured to death and say, we are being oppressed and we're threatened with extermination by what is basically a communist and racist regime, please take us in, then unless Mr. Orban is going to publicly admit that his words were empty, and I don't think he will, I think he's a good man fundamentally, then I think he should do something. And this is something that campaigners like you really need to work on, because there is a potential lifeline and somewhere to go. And it's not just Hungary, there's other countries in Central and Eastern Europe and Russia as well. They all know they have a demographic problem. They all know that, in fact, also they've got, especially as the communists wiped out so many entrepreneurs and so on, they know that they have a problem whereby their communities sometimes, their own people, sometimes lack a bit of entrepreneurial flair and spark and a real work ethic. And there's no better work ethic anywhere in the world than the Calvinists. And about the only people left in the world who are actual, real, genuine Calvinists are the Boers.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting you bring this aspect into it, because this is something that, to be honest with you, many people do not understand, is the Protestant Calvinist aspect. I myself am descended from the Huguenots, who were the Protestant Calvinists that fled from Europe to South Africa after they revoked the Edict of Nantes and replaced it with the Edict of Fontainebleau, which of course just went all full-scale Catholic persecution of the Protestant Calvinist race or groups that were in Europe at the time. And it seems like this agenda is still playing out. It seems like there still seems to be some kind of continuous persecution. And when you start looking at documentation, such as, if I may mention it, the extreme oath of the Jesuits, which is a very extreme Roman Catholic military order, it starts talking about, it clearly states there, to eliminate, exterminate heretics, liberals, Huguenots, Protestants, Calvinists. It lists the Huguenots, which I was is the basis upon which I actually wrote my first book back in 2010, and I explained all this, also pointing to the fact that, of course, our patron saint, Mr. Nelson Mandela, was in fact a Knight of Malta. He was in fact in allegiance with the Vatican and very much part of the communist socialist agenda to eliminate and exterminate the white race. In fact, there's videos of him online singing, killed Asama Amabulu, talking about killing the white man. He's got his hand up, in this communist pose, and people still revere him. And it's just absolutely insane that a terrorist who's clearly responsible for the deaths of so many people has gone on to become a president, installed a terrorist communist government, and is still revered internationally as being an icon of freedom. And we fed the idea that somehow if you're pro-apartheid, then you're anti-freedom, or if you are anti-apartheid, that you're pro-freedom. But again, this is this whole, as you were talking about, this liberal cancer that seems to be implanted into people at the moment, and that's actually twisting the ideas of what true freedom is really all about.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely so. A couple of sort of things just come to mind which are worth mentioning. The first is the fact that Hungary actually has quite a significant Calvinist minority. They're very, very well regarded. In fact, most of the leaders of Hungary's various revolutions, including the 56 uprising against the communists, against the Soviet occupation, most of the leaders have been Calvinists. So the Calvinists are very, very well regarded and understood in Hungary, and their value to the country will also be understood. And then as regards Catholicism, I think the one thing that I don't think there's much doubt about it, whereby the Catholic Church and specifically Rome has contributed really seriously to the mess that we are in, is the fact that the contraceptive pill was invented by a very staunch Catholic. It was promoted by elements linked to the Vatican, but promoted for everybody else. And very clearly their plan, their thought was that if they could have just one generation, or better still two, whereby everybody else restricted their birth rate, whereas Catholics carried on and did what human beings do naturally, then it would tilt the balance back in favour of Catholicism as against the Protestants, in any country where it went on. Unfortunately, of course, this thing ran out of hand. I've forgotten the man's name. The man who invented the pill has now said it was an unmitigated disaster. He wished to God he'd never done it, because it's condemned not just the Protestant countries of Northwest Europe to oblivion, as I think there was a section within the Vatican very clearly in the early 60s wanted. But if you look, you mentioned Portugal earlier on, you look at the birth rates, or the absence of birth rates in Italy, in Spain and Portugal, it's the worst of the lot. Spain has, at the last count, 3,000 entire villages which are now completely empty. Italy has several thousand villages which are completely empty. There simply aren't any children, any young people there at all. And there's opening up, especially in the country areas, which really is the root of any healthy national population. It's with farmers and it's people tilling the land and in close contact with nature, that they're being emptied by a combination of people going to the cities for work and so on, and simply by demographics. And in fact, it's now the Catholics who, despite the fact the church still preaches against contraception, they don't take a blind bit of notice, and they're wiping themselves out. As you mentioned again earlier in connection with Portugal and Spain, the fact that it's the one bit of Europe, well, it's not the one bit, it's the one bit of Western Europe, which historically was conquered by the Moors, by the Muslims. And that to the Muslims isn't something just historical. To them, any inch of land that has ever been under Muslim rule must be brought back under Muslim rule. I'll add here that I'm talking about the hardcore Salafist Wahhabis, a crank sect, but unfortunately they're a crank sect which is backed by the money of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and has really a grip on the Sunni populations of Western Europe, and a very strong grip on the Sunni populations of the Middle East as well. So a crank sect basically dominates the part of Islam which has come to the West, and they want Spain back, and they want Portugal back, and they believe they'll get it. For that matter, Muammar Gaddafi, who wasn't a hardcore Islamist, but nevertheless he was a Muslim, and he got his issues with Europe. There's this famous quote many of your viewers will come across of him saying that all the signs are that Europe will go and become part of the Muslim world, not with guns, not with violence, but simply because they're having children and we're not, and with immigration. And that is where we stand.
Wow. Okay. That's very intense. Karin, is there anything you want to add at this point?
There's some questions I'd like to ask, because you were talking about the Hungarians saying that they would take white Christian people into their country. Right. So the Prime Minister of Canada more or less said the same thing, that all refugees would be welcome in Canada. But a South African family who applied for asylum there were told that they had used racist excuses to get asylum there, that there was no such thing as farm murders in South Africa, that whites were under no threat in South Africa, and they must go back. So I'm just looking at the two countries, the two prime ministers saying the same thing, and yet in Canada, they are, well, he is closing off the borders now because so many are flowing out of the USA and into Canada, and he's getting a little bit concerned about this lot, is Trudeau. But I worry that because we are these dreaded apartheid oppressors of black people, we're not welcome anywhere, even as white Christians, because we are racist, we oppress the poor blacks, we are murderers. What we are undergoing in South Africa is karma, it's payback time, all of these things that we've heard over the years. That kind of worries me. Is there any, I don't suppose you can guarantee anything, but is there anything in your discussions there that would lead you to believe that we're not going to get that kind of response?
I would say so. Certainly, there is an element of that problem. When I discussed the problem, the plight of the Boers with some Russians, because the Russians, even Russian, or in fact, not just even Russian nationalists have inherited. They hate the Bolshevik thing. They're anti-communist, but they are very respectful of the Soviet defeat of Nazi Germany, the salvation of Russia in the Great Patriotic War. And they genuinely think of themselves as anti-colonialist and anti-racist. So then they think, well, weren't the whites in South Africa in some way guilty? So there's an element of that in the Russians. In Central Europe, I don't think so. These people are very much anti-liberal. And the thing you're describing with Trudeau and so on, this is a liberal disease. And it's not part of the DNA, say, of the right, the people now governing in Hungary. I think there's more. What I got more was from someone quite high up. He was very concerned that, well, because the Boers they're not English and they're from South Africa, are they black? Because we don't want them.
Okay, that kind of answers my question.
So there's that. No, I think it's more a matter of unfamiliarity with the issue is the problem, and in putting together a campaign package, which needs to be done from there by South Africans. I think you should stress, look how we suffered under the British with the concentration camps and so on. And try and dodge that issue to an extent. And just look at where we are today, which is we've got an endangered population, including young people with absolutely no future, and they'd be great for your country. And bear in mind also the idea the Boers are somehow racist. For Hungarians, they're being accused of the European Union every day of being racist. They're accused by the various NGOs operated and funded by George Soros of being racist and fascist. So they're accused of these things anyway, and they know it's not true in their case. So I think you have to take a little bit of a leap of faith and keep your fingers crossed and pray to God as well that given that they're not liberals in anything else, they won't be liberals in this case either.
Now, you just said something that really, really grates on me, and not because you said it. They're unaware of the problem. From where I sit, how is it possible that any government anywhere is unaware of this problem?
Well, it is quite incredible, but bear in mind that even good politicians are very, very busy. They've got a pile of work on their desk. They've got people poking them and prodding them and asking this, that and the other. They've got their own problems. Still, most young Hungarians speak very good English, but the older generation, some of them don't speak particularly good English. They certainly don't speak Afrikaans. So if you don't speak Afrikaans or English, how are you going to get this? And so it's not really surprising. And especially the Hungarian government, they are under intense pressure from the European Union and the powers basically behind and above the European Union. They're in constant fear of a so-called coloured revolution being organised to overthrow them. And when you've got the possibility that if you lose control of your own country, you're going to end up with some gang of CIA-inspired and funded goons hanging you from a lamppost, then it's logical that your main concern is going to be with what's happening in your country and on its borders and in the European superstate, which to a large extent controls your country. And South Africa is an awful long way away. So yes, they should know more, but equally, you can't really blame them. And the blame would rest more on us if between us we can't put together a really effective, a proper campaign to draw it to their attention.
So that's another question I'd like to ask you. Having been in British politics and having been in the European Parliament, tell me how much those two institutions are aware of and simply ignoring the South African situation.
Oh, the European Union, I would say they're quite well aware of it. I mean, I did my bit. I spoke about it several times in Parliament when I was there. The Vlaams Belang MEPs are very, very good. Philip Pleiss, when I was there, put on meetings about it. Udo Voigt has since is an NPD MEP from Germany. So we all, when we're there, we do our bit, which means basically that near the lifts in the Parliament, when you organise a special meeting about some subject, and the Greens have their meetings about saving some peculiar whale and all the rest of it, and the socialists have their meetings about the oppression of gender fluid people in Azerbaijan, and the Conservatives have their meetings about the threat of the European Union to business and so on. When they have these meetings, a poster goes up next to the main lift, and then a handful of people come to the meeting, and that's it. But it doesn't go anywhere because the Liberals who dominate the European Union, if they know, and certainly say in the case of the Dutch, they know perfectly well, right, that the Boers are there and that they actually have a duty to them, or at least a connection with them. It's not a matter of not knowing. It's a matter of not caring or actively hating them. They actively hate people like you and people like me and people that we want to look after and so on. They simply don't want anything to do with them. So the European Union knows. Britain knows. Of course Britain knows, because there's enough connection with South Africa through the English element there. And it's, in fact, in terms of a minority accent, you can't spend too long in central London and going to pubs and all the rest of it without coming across a youngish South African. So people in Britain, in the political elite, know precisely what's going on. They, as far as they're concerned, the sooner it's over, the better.
That's shocking. So what you're telling me is my greatest fear is that I'm going to wake up one morning and find that the Night of the Long Knives, the Uhuru thing, has happened in South Africa, and all the white South Africans are gone. Well, the majority have just gone overnight, because it is possible and it is planned. So what you're saying is that the world will just say, well, thank God for that.
Yes, it's a problem out of the way. It's very tragic and all the rest of it. And it'll be it might even make the news for a day or so.
Oh, wow, really?
But the left will think, well, that's wonderful. It'll be an embarrassment gone. And it means that, well, it's one of those things, so plenty of genocides get overlooked. There's only one which is special and is basically copyrighted. All the others, whether it's the genocide of the different ethnic groups in India at partition on both sides, basically, unless it's committed by white people, a genocide quickly gets just put into history, and it would be in the case of the Boers. Nobody now remembers that when the same kind of terrorists, for instance, were fighting to take Mozambique, and the other one, his name has slipped my attention. Sorry about that. The other country run by the Portuguese, just to the south of
Angola.
Angola, yes. When that war was at its most ferocious, you had things such as the entire families of men running logging stations being tied to planks and put through sawmills alive. Little white kids. But no one remembers it now. Now Angola and Mozambique are run by their own people, and it's all wonderful, and there's opportunities for Western big business to get in there with mines and land and all the rest of it, and it'll carry on from there. I think the future of Africa probably is as a Chinese plantation in any case, the way things are going. And the Chinese aren't particularly anti-white. They've got still a thing in terms of they still remember what the colonialists, the British, the French and the Americans did to them. And that really was a crime, forcing them to keep their borders open to opium, which was destroying the lives of millions of young Chinese every single generation. And we went to war to force them to accept it. You know, truly awful. And there's no doubt that there'll be a section in the Chinese brain which wants revenge for that. But on the whole, Chinese just want good business partners. And Europe should be a perfectly good business partner for the Chinese. They make things, we buy things. It should be a perfectly good relationship, which it already would be if it wasn't for the fact that the people running America, the American deep state elite and the banks there, are so determined to stop Russia and China forming an alliance basically with Western Europe, because it would isolate America as a giant island off the coast of the world economy. They're so determined to do that that they, for instance, imported basically a civil war into Ukraine to get in the way of the trade routes from China across to Europe. It's probably the main reason why not just George Soros, but the CIA, the whole of the American deep state, was so keen to use the destabilization that they caused in the Middle East, in Syria in particular, as the excuse and the prod to have what is now nearly 2 million young men of military age, all of them Muslims, in Germany, because any time they want to, any time they need to, they can plunge a part of Europe basically into civil war and thereby stop the natural development of a Eurasian landmass economy in which we get on quite well with the Chinese. But that's being disrupted. But for all they've disrupted that, they haven't disrupted the ongoing Chinese takeover of Africa, which is probably where it'll go. But as I say, the Chinese will watch it with interest, but there's no skin off their nose, really, who's alive and who isn't in South Africa when they come to take it over. In fact, if you wanted to be really brutal about it, if there's still a fraction of a white middle class in, say, farmland, actually running productive farm businesses, then how are the Chinese going to be able to say, let us take over this basically now barren land and we'll sort it out for you? So sadly, it's in the interest even of the Chinese to see the last white South African farmer gone, because at that point, you know what happens to the land over the next 4 or 5 years as the farm collapses, basically goes back to the veldt. So 10 years down the line, the Chinese can come along and say, look, this mess you've got, we'll sort it out for you. And the corrupt black ruling elite will say, oh, you sort it out, what am I going to get for it?
Yeah. So Nick, where is the benefit for the Western world in allowing the Russians and the Chinese to take over Southern Africa? Because in 2008, they passed a law making Chinese black in South Africa, so they don't have to comply with the BBB rules. The Russians have stepped in already and given an enormous, I think it's 1.9 billion rand to rescue Zebedelia, which is that huge citrus farm in South Africa that was taken over on a land claim, and they chopped the trees down and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a barren wasteland right now. So Russia stepped in and gave this 1-point-something billion rand to rescue that farm. The Chinese have taken over Lord knows how much of South Africa. The Russians have signed agreements to build nuclear power stations. Where is the benefit to the rest of the world to sit back and watch this happening?
I don't actually think there is a benefit. It's
so part of
the criminal stupidity of certainly the West European elites who have basically committed not just cultural and ethnic suicide for their people in their own countries, but they've also given up every shred of thought that it may be in our interests to be involved in the rest of the world. So I suppose that partly is a result. We're at the last stage now. The 68 generation has been in power for the last 20 years. This is a generation who in their student years were Maoists and Trotskyites, and they've been in power for the last 20 years. They're now starting to retire. We'll see the back of them quite soon. So, so for 20 years we've been run by people who hate everything to do with us and our kind and our history and our heritage. So they don't give a damn who takes over Africa as long as it's not the white man. From now on, we may perhaps have people who aren't influenced by that, but instead they're brought up with these, gender fantasies and all sorts of just crazy stuff. It's not even, at least the Marxists wanted a revolution and set about getting it. For in their own heads, the idea of global peace for the end of oppression. Actually, although wrong-headed, and certainly the answers were very wrong, at least you can understand where they were coming from. These were people with ideals, with sensible ideals from a certain perspective. The people who are now taking over the West, and I've seen them in Parliament myself, they're just crazies, airheaded liberal crazies. So don't expect any rationality from them. These are people in the grip of basically a pseudo-religious fantasy. And the more absurd they get, and the worse it gets, the more they're committed in the righteousness, of it all. That's what cults are. So we're run by a cult. Quite why the United States, on the other hand, has gone about doing everything it can to surround and provoke both Russia and China by messing in their backyards, while simultaneously basically seeming to stand back and leave especially the Chinese more or less a free hand in Africa. Most things in politics and geopolitics, I can form a reasonable idea. As to this, I haven't got the faintest idea why they're doing this. It's most peculiar.
It is to me, because if I look at the absolute uproar in the States at the moment about Uranium One, Hillary selling 20% of the uranium to Russia. Now, Zuma's son owned a uranium mine in South Africa, which he ran into the ground, and his staff left because he didn't pay them, etc. Now that mine is being sold to Roscom, same people as Uranium One, and there's no outcry anywhere about it, nowhere. So you would think if the US government was so concerned about the uranium going to Europe and Russia, why the hell are they standing by and watching this happen, Nick?
Yeah, as I say, I
can't.
I really don't know. It doesn't particularly bother me because Russia has geopolitical interests, and Russia is not hostile to us.
Yes.
Russia, most certainly, Russia is now the Christian superpower of the world.
Yeah.
Being re-Christianized. It's not yet the Christian leader of the world because it still allows abortion and murders hundreds of thousands of its own children every single year, while still having a demographic problem, which it's trying to cure, but it hasn't cured yet. So there's no logic to that, and there's no morality to that. So Russia isn't yet the Christian leader of the world in moral terms. Nobody is. But Russia is the leader of the Christian world. And what Russia has done in Syria and Iraq, destroying and helping the secular democratically elected governments there destroy ISIS, and now turning also on Al-Qaeda, where particularly Obama, but the whole of the American deep state and the Western European powers as well, have done everything possible to ensure that the jihadist lunatics were able to take over and destroy Syria, which includes a Christian minority. I've met with them and so on. They're all completely committed to Assad. They think he's absolutely wonderful because without him, they would have been wiped out long ago. And Russia, in moving in to help the Christians of the Middle East, has done something quite remarkable. And in giving the New World Order boys the bloodiest nose they've had in decades, has done something which puts Vladimir Putin as one of the great statesmen and heroes of our time. Having said which, Russia still has its geopolitical interests, which may not always, be the same as ours, but they're a damn sight closer to ours than those of the United States of America, unfortunately at present, which is run by a ruling elite, which has utter contempt for its own people, which is working on replacing its own people in their own homeland, especially through mass Mexican immigration, and which is a menace to the whole of the world.
Yeah. So, Nick, I'm not a political person, really. I campaign for white South Africans. I understand the problems in the country, but the politics behind it, I don't understand. I don't have a great brain for that. I didn't study any of it. But for me, what I cannot see is, okay, so the elite want to get rid of the whites of the world. Great, wonderful plan, whatever. But they're mostly white as well. So now what happens to them at the end of all of this? Or don't they care? Don't they care? It's me right now, and once I'm gone, it doesn't matter.
I think there's a large element of après moi le deluge. It doesn't matter as long as it doesn't happen on my watch and I'm well paid and all the rest. But then also they think of themselves as, above this, and they've got the money to be above this, or is to think they have. In New York or London, they live in gated communities.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in the USA, there's a lot of well-founded talk about how the real wealthy elite, the real 1%, are buying themselves up ranches in the most remote places.
Yeah.
They're buying land in South America and so on. They're buying places which are simply okay. For all that Hungary is condemned by all the liberal elite, it's criticised for anti-Semitism, completely untrue. But for all of that, the Western elites and the Israeli elite are pouring money into property in Budapest because Budapest is a lovely city. It's the Paris of the East. And it's a great investment because if you go there, any time from now on, basically, say if you go to a Christmas market in Britain or in France or in Germany, they're ringed with armed police and with soldiers, and you've got a reasonable chance of being run over and crushed by a truck. Whereas you go to Budapest and the Christmas market is exactly like they used to be in Europe, 5 or 6 years ago. So Budapest is very attractive, and the same liberal elite who are working very hard to destroy Western Europe, they're very happy to buy property in Budapest because it's a nice safe bolt hole. There's a horrible hypocrisy, or I think perhaps sometimes they don't even see it. They're so wrapped up in this crazy messianic cult vision of this new world they're creating that they manage to disassociate the problems it causes from their own lives. So if they want to go and on holiday in Budapest, it's to see how quaint it is or whatever, or to meet real Hungarians and try and persuade them to reject Viktor Orban. And they perhaps don't even realise that the reason they like Budapest is it reminds them of what Paris was before their French colleagues set about destroying it over the last 30 years.
So they're working on the same principle then, it seems to me, as these Africans who are now fleeing from Africa, having destroyed it, turned it back into a desert and a wasteland. We're now going to go to Europe and turn that country into the same thing that we fled from and left behind. So it would appear to me the elites are doing exactly the same thing. We are going to destroy the white countries where we live and rule, and then go somewhere else and do the same thing all over again until there's nowhere else to go. But they won't care because they're not alive anymore.
Yeah.
No, for me, Nick, I don't get that. For me, my grandchildren are the apples of my eye. They are the most wonderful things ever. They are the most important thing in my life. I want them to have a better world than I had. And yet I'm seeing the world go to hell around me. They can't play. They can now where we live, but I don't know for how much longer. Can't play in the streets, can't ride their bicycles. They're not safe in supermarkets. You have to hold their hand wherever you go. Not yet where I live, but I see it all over the world. And that's what I escaped South Africa to give them a better life. Now, how is it that little Karin Smith from Pampa, Texas, feels the strong desire to create a better world for the kids, and the elites couldn't give a damn?
Yeah,
it doesn't. It
is peculiar. I think it's mainly to do with money. Money, vast amounts of money and power does corrupt, and it cuts people off. Again, I saw this in Parliament that the MEPs, a lot of them have gone into politics with the best intentions, whether they're on the far left, the far right, or in the middle, whatever they are. They went into it, some of them with the best intentions. But once they're there and they're treated so specially and so on, and for instance, at the entrance, there's a special blue carpet. And if you're an MEP, you can walk on the blue carpet. But if you're not, you mustn't walk on the blue carpet. So the ordinary citizens, the taxpayers, mustn't walk on the blue carpet. And if you do, there's there's an official stood there looking very smart. And if a non-MEP walks, he rushes over to them and basically throws them out. And this sort of, it makes the MEPs feel, I'm very special and all the rest of it. And they get more and more cut off from real people. And from reality. They don't actually know the result of what they're doing in most cases. They haven't got a clue. I'll give you one specific example of this. I was on the environmental committee, or subcommittee in the Parliament. And at the very first meeting I attended in 2009, there was a motion where they were discussing a new law proposed by the European Commission, because the elected members of Parliament are not allowed to create laws, even to propose laws. They can only rubber stamp or temporarily reject what the Commission comes up with. So the place is run by the unelected bureaucrats. One country, they're appointed by the political elites in those countries. But the MEPs think they run the show, but they don't. So in this committee meeting, there was a proposal on the table to make it a rule that every single gallon or litre of fuel sold in the whole of Europe for cars had to have a certain amount of bioethanol in it. So not be just oil, but have a certain amount produced from crops, from maize or from grain, sugarcane or whatever. And I said to them, look, I've only just got here, but I can tell you what you're going to do here. If you pass this regulation, you're going to be putting the world's poorest people into competition with the world's richest drivers for food. Because a piece of land cannot grow two crops. Either the crop will be grown for food, for poor people in places like Africa or wherever, or it's grown for your Mercedes-Benz. And if you do that, you will starve people in the poorest parts of the world. Because if the price of grain goes up a little bit, people in Western Europe can afford to pay a bit more for their bread. So there's millions of people in the third world who will starve if you do this. And they said, oh, no, it's not like that. No, you're wrong. This will be fine. And at my very last meeting in 2014, 5 years later, they were discussing the urgent need to abolish this regulation because it was putting the poor of the world into competition with drivers in Western Europe who could afford to pay more for the produce of the land. So I said, I did tell you this 5 years ago. They wouldn't have it. They couldn't remember it. Their brains are switched off from this. No, it's not right. These people are so cut off from reality. They're incapable of learning from their own past mistakes. And none of them are actually real students of history and real life. So when you get well-meaning lunatics cut off from reality, seeking to change the world, I'm afraid that, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yeah. And when many of the people of the same elite are working on the basis of very bad intentions and pure greed and hatred of people like us, you put all these things together and you've got a recipe for hell on earth.
So we talk about the Washington bubble, and we talk about people living in their ivory towers. And I've always thought that that's a little bit the opposite of elitist, whatever that would be, peasantist, to look at the rich and think of them in that way. But what you've just said, that is absolutely true. They live in a bubble totally divorced from the world, the outside world, inhabited only by the rich who don't see, like in South Africa, they don't see the white camps. They don't see the poverty. They don't see the struggle. They are so insulated from it that their ideas are the only ones that could possibly be correct.
Yeah, I think as a rule, if you give human beings, most human beings, the chance to be very rich and very powerful, then they will seize that chance and they will then set about constructing a worldview which says they're doing good and that they're right. Because people, even bad people, apart from pure psychopaths, people that want to think of themselves as bad. So they're going to do these things and they're going to think of themselves as good. But they're just rationalizing. They'll find a way to rationalize doing the most ghastly things. I'll give you, if you like, one more example of how cut off people are in these bubbles. We used to have to vote typically on each day in the voting, three voting days per month. We'd have to vote to rubber stamp or temporarily reject, typically probably 800 or 900 separate votes in the course of 2 hours.
Wow.
So you don't actually get a chance to look at them or decide. It's literally raise your hand, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, at this sort of speed, or you're pressing a button if it's an electorate vote and it's very important. So it's what the party apparatchiks say is how the MEPs must vote, is how they vote. They've no idea on what they're voting on. But because I was part of such a small group, we actually had to do the work ourselves. So for the day and the night before, when you finally got this long list of what you had to vote on, you'd go through and decide generally what was the lesser of two evils. And there was one I spotted where they were talking about spending, I've forgotten what it was on, but they were talking about spending 170 trillion euros on something very minor. Because, of course, it was a typo. It was just a typographical error. They meant 170 million. So they inflated it by a factor of, I don't even know how many. Well, I don't even know if it's in a trillion. But it was more money than the whole of Europe had. It was a fantastic sum of money. But this had gone through the committee stage, the revision stage, the committee stage, and then this final stage, and no one had spotted it. For the simple reason that it's not their money. They don't care. They're not paying attention. They're just doing these things which they think is probably good. And the reason in the end they think it's good is that in some way or another, they and their class or the people funding them are benefiting from it. And that's what goes on in the European Parliament. I have no reason to suppose it's any different in Washington or in London or in Paris or anywhere else for that matter. That's what elites do.
Yeah. Absolutely. Talking about elites, and you mentioned the New World Order earlier. I know this is a contentious subject, but I'd be interested to hear what your views on this are.
I think, in fact, there's not one New World Order. Bush used the phrase and was talking about a world ruled by the elite, in particular a world ruled by the people who rule the United States, officially in the interest of the United States, but of course it's not. The people running the United States started off their grab for world power with the most brutal war against the people of the southern states, which was more or less a war of extermination there as well. Certainly in economic terms it was. And then in 1913 they created the Federal Reserve, which is certainly not federal, but it certainly is criminal. So you've got the United States run by and in the interests of a private banking cartel. And so you can call it the New World Order. I would say it's wrong in a way. If people think this is one monolithic block, then I think they're getting the wrong end of the stick. Because I think it's more the fact that there's competing blocks within the elite. Sometimes they'll work together. Basically, they'll work together to screw us, the little people, but then they'll fight like cat and dog for a bigger slice of the pie. Yeah. When various Wall Street banks funded the Russian Revolution, the Rothschilds lost out because the Rothschilds had invested vast amounts of money, maybe from France, into Tsarist Russia, and the whole lot was wiped. So the Rothschilds lost that round, and various other banks gained in that round. So it's not a monolith, but it tends to be that their interests coincide. And they're pushing and prodding politicians in roughly the same direction. So it's more accurate to call it a New World Order and say that there's an elite plot to screw us all than to poo-poo the whole idea and say this is a crazy conspiracy and no, everything's above board and what you see in Washington, D.C. is what you get, which it most definitely is not.
Certainly not. And it just seems that way with most politics, and we're watching the corruption. Of course, one of the things I found very interesting since we onto the subject of, a one world order or a new world order, it's interesting to notice that the UK, obviously, the famous Brexited very recently, and we're all kind of holding our breath, wondering what is this really all about, and how is this going to affect, the economy in the UK? What do you think?
Well, first of all, what's it all about? It was rather like the unexpected Trump victory. This was probably the last real political gasp, a scream of rage from the ordinary people from the tail end of the baby boom generation, saying we don't like what the elite had done to our country. We don't feel at home here. It's not just the immigration. They've changed in Britain. They've changed our money. They've changed our weights and our measures. They've changed everything. So the England I grew up in no longer exists. Whereas the England I grew up in was absolutely familiar to my grandparents and would have been familiar to their parents. It's now utterly changed beyond all recognition, and the bastards never asked us. That's the thing that really upsets people. If they'd asked us and we'd said, yeah, go ahead, do it, fair enough. But you didn't ask us. And instead you say it's good for us, and if we object, we're racist and fascists and bigots or reactionaries. So there was a scream of rage from ordinary people, and we got this vote. If the elite, the Tory, the Conservatives, had the sense to wait another 2 or 3 years, it would have gone the other way, because the demographics would have finished it. Because roughly speaking, 400,000 old Brits die each year, and they're generally replaced by 400,000 or 500,000 new Brits, most of whom aren't British at all, and who would go along with Europe primarily because they've got no old attachment to what used to be, and no nostalgia and no love for what used to be. So they're not angry about the fact it's gone. So that's how it happened. As to what happens now, well, it's very difficult to tell, actually. Was it a blow to the New World Order boys? At one level, yes, because the European Union was supposed to be basically one of the regional building blocks of a one world government, without a shadow of a doubt. But on the other hand, I think it's fairly clear that there's sections of the Conservative Party who take their orders from the neocons in the United States. And I think the neocons have concluded that while the European Union was a bloc against the Soviet Union, it was a good thing. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed in '89, for a while they remained basically agnostic. They couldn't give a damn what happened in Europe. It didn't seem to matter. But when there emerged signs that Germany, or rather Europe run by Germany, was going to cozy up to Russia, which is a very sensible economic arrangement, actually. Basically, Russia is a vast open space with huge amounts of raw materials. And Western Europe, especially Germany, are technological superpowers, markets and so on. And the two economies would actually be very, very useful, tied closer together. And when this started to become a possibility, at that stage, I think the American-based neocons, who've got the goal not just of American military hegemony, but also economic hegemony, no one else must be in a position to challenge it and challenge them. They decided that Europe must be disrupted. And you see it with what Merkel has done with bringing in all the Muslim, importing a future civil war. In 1 year, she imported, I think, basically 10 times more men than the German army has. So you see everyone knows what's going to happen. So at that point, the neocons decided to disrupt disrupt Europe, and they started to fund groups like the Five Star Movement in Italy and UKIP in Britain. So there's a section of the American elite, I think, are happy with Brexit, and there's also a section who were deeply unhappy, represented by Obama, because he was only a figurehead anyway. So I think that there's a certain disagreement amongst the elite in the USA. In Britain, the elite is overwhelmingly in favour of Remain, and there's still a possibility they'll get it. We may not leave. If we don't leave, then the old traditional British population will be even more angry and even more disenchanted with politics and all the rest of it. It's a very dangerous situation. If they were young, then there'd be a revolution. But old people don't make revolutions. They sit and grumble and they die. So we may not get Brexit. On the other hand, the Conservative Party may see the opportunity that they really do screw over the opposition doing it. So we might go ahead. I don't know. I've thought several times it is going ahead, how remarkable. Other times I think, no, they'll drag it out. And in the end, they'll say for some reason or other, we have to have a new vote. This will be 5-6 years down the line, by which stage 2 million of the old voters who basically voted to leave will have died. That have been replaced by 2 million people, 2.5 million people who will tend to say remain. They'll have another vote and that'll settle it. Probably the way the European Union will end, in fact, though, is that what it's trying to force on Central Europe, namely, you've seen Poland, Hungary, places like this, they've seen very clearly what mass immigration, and mass Muslim immigration in particular, has done to places like Britain and France, partly because they've had so many of the young people come to work here. They've seen it, they don't like it, they're Christian, we're atheist and liberal, and they don't want it. So I think that there's more chance of the European Union falling apart as a result of the centre of Europe leaving than there is actually Britain leaving.
Wow. You know, Nick, I'm looking at the world. You keep talking about us as old people who'll be dead at at that time and whatever. But I do agree with you, because recently, in the last couple of years, I've been thinking, I'm so glad I'm older now. I don't have to live through all of this, but my family do. And I still would like to. I think maybe I'm too much of an idealist in some respects, although reality has impinged hard on my life. I want to turn a better world over to my child and my grandchildren. And I don't see how we, the masses, have any power to do that. It would appear, from speaking to you for the last hour or so, it would appear that we have no say, no power. But then I think of the blacks in South Africa rising in their masses and taking to the streets and getting what they want by sheer mass action. So now I'm even more confused than when I started.
Yes, think not just of that, but think of moments in European history when, all history, when tiny numbers of men and women, very often through the most incredible self-sacrifice, have woken up whole populations, have changed things beyond all recognition. Strange things do happen, revolutions do occur. But in this case, there's the book Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand.
Yes. Which,
taken at the level she wrote it, is actually a hymn to outrageous selfishness. And when it was a reaction to the craziness of socialism in a basically mono-ethnic America, it had its good points. But when people, and there's lots of the young sort of intellectual young neocons and alt-right types and so on the liberal end, who think it's a wonderful book and that's the way to go, it's hideously out of date. When you're part of a population which is faced by other entire blocks of populations who hate and detest you, when the only way of surviving and having your culture and your kind survive is to stick together, then a book which preaches the ultimate selfishness, I'll never ask that any man shall live his life for me and I won't live my life for anyone else, it's a recipe for suicide. So we have to put that absolutely firmly behind us. But there is one key element, I think, which we could take on and adopt. And that's her idea when the hero of it, I think it's Francisco, is asked, well, if you saw Atlas staggering under the weight and holding up the world, what would you say to him? And the answer is shrug. Don't bother. Mm. So why should the remaining white farmers of South Africa work so hard for anything which sooner or later they know perfectly well a black Marxist government is going to take off them legally, if they're not shot, just to keep these people in food? Why should they do it? Why should I encourage my grandchildren, say, to go into the law or something, or engineering in Western Europe, and become the people who will be expected to keep millions and millions of stupid old swine who were too selfish to vote the right way to do anything to save their society, and millions more imported parasites who are unwilling or incapable of doing any work? I think we should just say, shrug. Go somewhere where you can work for yourself, for your people, for your own people, for your family, for a government, for a people who appreciate you. And any state which doesn't appreciate you, let them go hang. And it's no good for us, but you've got grandchildren, I've got grandchildren. I'm not disappointed by this. I don't think, I wish I didn't, I'm glad I won't be there to see it. I'm very annoyed I'm going to be too old when the struggle really starts. Because once the struggle really starts, the struggle to get our people out, the struggle to save our people, the struggle where there are enclaves which really can be protected once the veneer of liberal civilization is gone, then that will be a wonderful time to be a young man, because young men don't mind the risk of dying, partly because they think they're immortal. Sometimes they found out they're not. That's what they're for. It's going to be a wonderful time when you can see that in 2 generations, the whole of Europe basically is going to be effectively empty. This wonderful rich farmland, ruined cities, but wonderful farmland with no people to grow food for, and certainly no people to use it. Then at that point to be thinking, look at my grandchildren. And they're going to inherit that land. They're going to walk back into this empty space. They might have to clear out some bandits and crazes and fanatics, but they're going to go back and using the most modern technologies, 3D machines that can use broken rubble and turn it into buildings. And they can use pictures of fine old buildings. They can do that. They can take this ultra-modern technology and go back and become free soil farmers in their own land with their own culture. And we can rebuild Europe. What a wonderful adventure. But it's not for you and me. It's for our grandchildren or for their children. But I wish I was young enough to see it.
Well, okay. So here's my other question. You know that we call them snowflakes in America. Yes. They're right. So those snowflakes who are huddling in their mom's basement and coming out in their black masks and whatever and having a total failure of taking over the USA last weekend, They're much vaunted. We're coming. We're taking over the USA. We're killing every conservative. Yeah, the biggest amount of them that turned up was 200 in New York City, and the rest was a total failure. Apparently funded in the millions by George Soros, but that's all according to the newspaper. And if you believe them, well, you know. Anyway, so we have this youth. This is our youth who've been totally brainwashed by schools, by universities, by life, who can't work and don't work because they have no education worth having by the workforce. Are those the people who are going to chase the bandits out? I don't think so.
No. They're the people who are going to die childless. Or they might occasionally have one child between a pair of them. And then their children do the same thing. Within 3 generations, they'll be statistically utterly irrelevant. They're, if you like, an evolutionary dead end. Finished. Going nowhere. Let them melt. The snowflakes.
Survival of the fittest.
But it's our grandchildren. It's the grandchildren of people that we inspire with programs like this. You don't need very many. One of the things that Einstein said that was very, very true is he's supposed to have said that there's the greatest force in the universe is the power of compound interest. And compound interest also works in demographic change.
Yeah.
If you fail to have enough children to reproduce, your population won't disappear in the next generation, but it will be drastically reduced, say, by 30%. The next generation, when you compound, you take another 30% off that. The population disappears within 100 years. And similarly, if you look, say, at the Amish, 100 years ago, the Amish in America had just 5,000 people. They now have some 400,000. Their population doubles every 18 years because these are people who they work very hard, they have children, they stick together as a community. Most important of all, they ensure that their children are brought up according to their values in schools that they run, and they don't send them off to get to university to get law degrees and to find out that they were never sure about their gender anyway, then to end, basically to live their lives in New York or London, making vast amounts of money, being utterly miserable, and in the end dying alone in some grassy flat. Because that's the way they go. And that's the future, as I said earlier on, which you found funny. It's the people who have children will inherit the earth. So there's no reason to be depressed about this, but the answer is those who understand it, those who want to live, should set about finding places where we can build stable, sustainable, which sadly isn't South Africa. I agree to say that. It's not Oriana. It can't be done. Because as soon as a piece of grotty, useless desert is turned into a really productive farmland, then the government will activate its power to take it away, and anyone who resists will be shot. So that's the end of it. But where there are places that we can get our children to, and encourage other people to, and make little havens of stability and sense, they will attract other people who want to survive. Because there's plenty of young people who aren't snowflakes. Plenty of them. The majority aren't snowflakes. They're the ones we notice. They're the noisy ones. There's others who want to get on and have a decent life. And as they see they cannot have a decent life in collapsing Western Europe, and because the demographics of North America are equally as bad, in due course in the collapsing US of A. But the USA probably has sufficient space that there are places where people like us can go and establish communities that are safe. And people in America have, more than anything else, the right to bear effective arms. So in the end, a community which sticks together is going to be safe. So Americans don't have to go to Hungary to find somewhere where their grandchildren can build a really wonderful society which will attract the refugees, the real refugees from the collapsing liberal world. And, that's where we are. I don't know if in South Africa or if American watchers would have it. Did you used to have the game when you were kids, when you threw a pile of sticks down on the floor or the table, and then you each take a stick out? And
pick up sticks.
Pick up sticks.
Yes.
And you keep on taking out the sticks, and it doesn't fall down.
Yes.
And that's a wonderful analogy for what the liberals have done to our society. They keep on taking out the sticks, and it doesn't fall down. There comes a moment when one more stick comes out, and the whole lot crashes. And when it does, those who are close to it, those who are part of it, those who are living in its cities, when the lights go out, they and theirs are going to get burned and destroyed. But the ones who've moved away from it, it'll be their kids that have the future. I've always been a British loyalist in Northern Irish terms, so against the IRA, which is a Marxist organisation. But Bobby Sands, the hunger striker, a man completely wrong but extraordinarily brave, he starved himself to death, one of 10, to make a point that he believed he was a political prisoner. He should be allowed to wear his own clothes and not the uniform of a British prison. He starved himself to death for that. He was a part of a murdering terrorist bunch every bit as bad as Mandela and the ANC. Although they didn't necklace people, but they blew people up with bombs and all the hideous things they did. Stan said one wonderful thing when he said to the enemy, he said, "Our revenge will be the laughter of our children." For us, perhaps, we had to extend it. Karin and I, we had to extend it. Our revenge will be the laughter of our great-grandchildren, but we know they're going to be there.
So for me then, the survivalists, the people in the little villages here that they call flyover country, that Hillary found no need to go and visit or to talk about, those are the people in their communities like ours, a very, very close-knit, small community where we know each other and care about each other, take care of each other. So, if you know your neighbor is not feeling well, so you take her some chicken soup. It happens all over my little town. Mm-hmm. So those are the places where you want to be. But if you look at what they did to that small little Texas community on Sunday, a community of 400 people, everybody knows everybody. Mm-hmm. So you go into the church and you shoot up 50 people. That 8 people from one family were killed in that. I can't help thinking that there's some ulterior motive behind that. And I don't wear a tinfoil hat, I promise you, Nick. Mm-hmm. I don't buy into conspiracy theories, and I try and keep my feet on the ground. But they are hitting blue-collar workers, hard-working survivalists, people who breed, have big families, where it hurts the most.
Yes.
And that is what scares me, that even in a small little place like that, with the whole community holding hands together and loving each other and taking care of each other, they can slaughter 50 of you in one shot.
Yes, absolutely terrible. But again, think back into the very recent history of the United States with the frontier tradition, that the risk of being massacred on your way to church or in church in your beds by the local savages was always there. You got on with it, and you took your guns to church, and if they turned up, you blew them away. So we are. It's very sad that we're ending the period where actually you could be a really nice, kind, civilized, gentle person to everybody, and expect to get through life and have your family get through life as well. We're entering an era of horror and violence and brutality. Part of the struggle will be to have the resistance to this, our kind of people, to ensure that they are decent and they remain decent in this horror. It's why I've come to the conclusion that Christianity is such an important part of this struggle, because when you see, but basically, when it all goes down the tubes, who do you want? Do you want a biker gang, which vaguely follows the thoughts of Nietzsche or Hitler or whatever? The strongest shall, the strongest survive. The strongest take what they want. This is the rule of the jungle. Or do you want a revived muscular Christianity, which isn't ashamed to carry arms for the defense of the faithful and of decent communities and so on? So the revival of the old idea of the knight or the Knights Templar, that revival of a militant Christianity which doesn't go out to cause trouble, but is prepared to raise a sword or the modern equivalent in defence of communities and in defence of its faith. And I think that will come. And when you see it like that, in the end, which is the healthier people, which is the better life of the men and women and children who built and sometimes died building the American frontier, or the couch potatoes of today? The couch potatoes, it's more comfortable, it's much more polite, it's more politically correct, but who actually lived as men? Who really lived as women? Who really savoured and took part in life? Who was alive and who was already dead even while they were still walking around the streets? The idea of the zombie is not that far off what people in liberal consumerist society have been living as for decades. And as I say, I think it's a fantastically exciting time is coming, albeit it's going to be at times very unpleasant, because all this decadence and this softness and this stupidity and this being cut off from nature and cut off from the real world and reality and cut off from our ancestors and their wisdom is all going to come to a grinding halt really quite soon. And
so what you're telling me,
those who survive it will be better for it.
What you're telling us, Nick, is that the world needs a Boer, because the Boer encompasses all of those things that you have just been talking about. He's a Christian. He has firm faith, good beliefs, hardworking, willing to live in peace, but don't push me into a corner because I will fight. So thank you, Nick. You have just proved everything that Mel and I have ever said about a Boer. The world needs the Boers, and the Boers need the world to pay attention to that they are the saviors of this wreck of a world that we live in. We're coming to the end of the show, Nick. Do you have some final thoughts? Those were mine, by the way. Final thoughts.
Those are yours. Right. So a Boer saying, which I know, but I won't attempt to pronounce in Boer, but the saying, a Boer will make a plan.
A Boer maak 'n plan. Yeah, right. But there's an answer to that, Nick. And a vrou maak 'n plan wat werk. And a woman makes a plan that works.
Right then. So, final thoughts that you women need to take on board the fact that if we can open the door just a little bit in Hungary to a few Boers, and Hungary is the most likely place. I've tried in Russia, I've tried Belarus, great response there, but you're dealing with Russians. They have a different concept of time to us. They're Europeans, but they're not Europeans like we are. Wonderful people, a different concept of time. They're very keen on the idea, but nothing will happen until something happens that, oh, we should have done that, we'll do it.
Yeah.
But I think that if we could open the door to just a few people in Hungary, then because, say, looking at Serbia, birth rate 1.2 children per woman of childbearing age. Catastrophic. They're faced with, they're on basically the border of Europe. They were, in modern cultural history, they were occupied by the Turks and they got their country back. But they don't want to disappear. They know they need more people. So if we can open just a door in Hungary, other nations in that part of the world will see. And it's wonderful land, it's wonderful climate, wonderful people. And they haven't bought into all this liberal poison. It'd be a great place to be. We've just got to get a few people there, and then the other countries will sit up and take notice. And then either because it's in their interest to take the Boers, and I declare a personal interest in this also because I want them to see through doing it with the Boers, I want the gates to be opened also for my people, from my country as well. But if Hungary does it and it works, then Hungary for its own self-interest will do it more and more, and other countries will then follow suit. And on top of that, if just a few have gone, then if and when the ghastly plan does unfold in South Africa and the genocide really starts, it's unlikely to be over in a week. In some places, people will survive, they'll get out, they'll be, because these are men and women who've got a pioneer spirit and a determination and more intelligence than those who would kill them and all the rest. So some will survive. Some will get across to the border into Mozambique and sit there with the Mozambique blacks looking at them and, well, what are we going to do with you? We don't really know. Some will get away, and if there's even just a few already in certain countries, then the doors will be much more easy to open. So make a plan to get the pressure on, to get just a few there. Come back to me and we'll work on it. I'll do what I can. I've got a law case coming up in December trying to re-establish my right to go back into Hungary. That's a different story entirely.
Yeah.
That would obviously make things better. But let's try and do that. And certainly, in the meantime, keep up the work you're doing. You said earlier in this conversation, sometimes you wonder if it's worth it. It is worth it, absolutely, because I know there's so many people who are sort of from the right, who 5 or 6 years ago just thought of South Africa as something in the past, and it's finished and it's gone, but so we move on. And now there's this burning feeling, they understand the Boers are there, they understand the danger that they're in, but they want to do something to help. But what can you do that's concrete? If we can pull this plan together, well then instead of just saying it's a terrible thing, oh, white genocide of Boers, it's awful, they can say, right, I'm putting $10 a month aside into a fund, which is buying another piece of Hungary or Serbia you can buy a good little farm there for $5,000 or $6,000. So we're going to buy 3 or 4 farms and have them ready for the next families who are able to get out. We can start doing practical things like that. Just what we can do is open the door just a little bit and start it.
Thank you very, very much, Nick. That was an incredible, wide-ranging discussion. We covered just about everything. But I'm going to end this again. What Nick has just said is the world needs a Boer, and we need to make them aware of their need for these Boers. Thank you very, very much, Nick. And thank you, Mel.
Yes, thank you, Nick. It's been a great pleasure. Very interesting to talk to you. And thank you for everybody who has tuned in. As always, you can check out Karin's stuff on radiofreesouthafrica.com. The archive of the show will be in ccn.media. And of course, we'll see you back here next week for another episode of Stop South African Genocide. It's been great. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire: the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.